Welcome to U.S. History since 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history after Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on Middle East interventions after 9/11. The core question is this: how much authority should a frightened democracy hand to its government after thousands of civilians are murdered in a single morning? The core competency is to characterize America's various foreign policy interventions across the Middle East before and after 9/11-2001. How much authority should a frightened democracy hand to its government after thousands of civilians are murdered in a single morning? That is the proper starting point for post-9/11 intervention. The attacks on September 11, 2001 killed nearly 3,000 people, destroyed symbols of finance and military administration, and convinced millions that distance no longer protected the homeland. Fear, grief, anger, and the demand for action were real. So was the danger that emergency would become a permanent method of rule. The choices made after 9/11 did not stay overseas. Congress, courts, airports, police departments, intelligence agencies, immigration systems, military commands, and private contractors all changed routine. A war fought against a network rather than a state pulled the United States toward broader definitions of threat and broader claims of executive authority. The old habits of pre-9/11 intervention remained available, but they were now fused to a public mood, willing to tolerate more surveillance, longer war, and more aggressive prevention. 9/11 created an argument about permission. How far could the presidency go? How broad could Congress write war authority? How much secrecy could intelligence agencies claim? How many years could occupation continue before a temporary emergency became a normal system? These questions shaped policy because the state responded through law, money, detention sites, drone programs, watch lists, new departments, and new bureaucratic routines that outlived the first shock. The civic problem is therefore double. A government that fails to respond looks weak and irresponsible. A government that responds without durable limits may save itself from one form of vulnerability by creating another. Post-9/11 intervention sits inside that trap. The world before 9/11 already contained American military presence in the Middle East, sanctions on Iraq, no-fly zones, alliances with Saudi Arabia and other Gulf monarchies, and a counterterrorism apparatus that had grown during the 1990s. Al-Qaeda had attacked U.S. targets before 2001, including the East African Embassy bombings in 1998 and the USS Cole in 2000. Yet the broader national assumption still treated terrorism as a grave but manageable danger, not as the organizing principle of the entire state. Legally, the Constitution divided war powers between Congress and the president, but late 20th century practice had already blurred those lines. Presidents used force with varying degrees of legislative consent. Intelligence agencies operated under classified authorities. Sanctions and covert partnerships allowed action below the threshold of declared war. Domestic surveillance remained constrained by reforms that followed Watergate, including the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978. But even those constraints depended on public confidence that emergency exceptions would remain limited. The armed forces were also in a particular posture. The all-volunteer military had become highly professional, technologically sophisticated, and politically respected after the trauma of Vietnam. The 1991 Gulf War reinforced confidence that the United States could remove enemies quickly with precision and overwhelming force. The lesson many officials drew from the 1990s was that limited, well-equipped intervention could achieve strategic goals without mass mobilization. That confidence would shape both Afghanistan and Iraq. Bureaucratic planning before the attacks also left institutions ready to scale quickly once permission widened. Special Operations Command had expanded during the 1990s. The CIA had already tracked al-Qaeda after the East Africa bombings, and cruise missile retaliation in 1998 had accustomed officials to the idea of striking militants across borders without conventional declarations of war. The continuity shows that the response after September 11th was not improvised from nothing. It accelerated tools, legal theories, and command relationships already under construction. There were alternative paths after the attacks. The United States could have treated al-Qaeda as a narrower, though still serious transnational enemy, leaned more heavily on intelligence cooperation and targeted operations, and refused to fold unrelated regional ambitions into the emergency. It might still have gone to war in Afghanistan while avoiding the much broader doctrine that followed. Those alternatives were politically weak in September 2001 because public demand for decisive action was immense and because key officials already believed American power could reorder hostile regions. Congress responded first with sweeping permission. On September 14, 2001, it passed the authorization for use of military force, empowering the president to use force against those he determined planned, authorized, committed, or aided the attacks, and those who harbored them. That language widened war power because it attached force to a network of actors rather than to one state with one front line and one surrender ceremony. Lawyers and commanders could keep finding targets inside the same authorization years later. The invasion of Afghanistan began in October 2001. The initial military objective was straightforward enough: destroy al-Qaeda's sanctuary and topple the Taliban regime that sheltered it. U.S. Special Operations Forces, CIA teams, air power, and Afghan anti-Taliban militias moved quickly. Kabul fell. The Taliban government collapsed. Yet early battlefield success did not settle the governing problem. Al-Qaeda leadership dispersed. The Taliban retreated across terrain and borders favorable to insurgency. State building, counterinsurgency, corruption control, allied burden sharing, and opium economics then entered the picture. Occupation required administrators, aid personnel, contractors, translators, logistics officers, military police, and provincial teams. Roads had to be secured, elections organized, police trained, and local strongmen managed. Each task carried friction. Kabul politics were not the same as village politics. U.S. forces rotated in and out on timelines shaped by domestic politics and military strain. Pakistan's border regions complicated any clean military map because insurgents could regroup in spaces American power could pressure only imperfectly. At home, the Patriot Act of October 2001 widened surveillance and investigative authority. Sections dealing with business records, roving wiretaps, and information sharing lowered barriers between intelligence and law enforcement. The creation of the Department of Homeland Security in 2002 reorganized border, immigration, emergency, and infrastructure functions into a massive new cabinet department. Airport screening shifted under the Transportation Security Administration. Watch lists multiplied. Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities experienced scrutiny, detentions, interviews, and private suspicion that often far exceeded any evidence. Occupation paperwork multiplied as fast as troop deployments, and the Office of Legal Counsel wrote memoranda on detention and interrogation. The Coalition Provisional Authority issued orders that reshaped Iraqi political life, including CPA Order No. 1 on de-Baathification in May 2003, and Order No. 2 dissolving the Iraqi military days later. Those texts reshaped occupation as much as battlefield maps. They stripped away institutions without building replacements strong enough to control arsenals, payrolls, or neighborhood order, and they widened the pool of armed men with grievances against the occupation. Emergency power becomes attractive to officials because it promises speed across a sprawling risk environment. If the threat might be hidden inside encrypted communication, informal finance, immigration flows, or remote training camps, then every agency can claim it needs more data, more secrecy, and more latitude. The price is that ordinary legal thresholds begin to look like dangerous delay. Once that logic settles in, temporary expansion hardens into routine governance. Iraq took that logic further. Senior officials in the Bush administration linked Saddam Hussein to a broader doctrine of preemption and regime change. They argued that weapons of mass destruction, hostile intent, and the possibility of transfer to terrorists made waiting irresponsible. The October 2002 congressional authorization and the March 2003 invasion followed. Baghdad fell quickly, and once again military victory in the opening phase disguised the political difficulty to come. The occupation of Iraq magnified every weakness that Afghanistan had already exposed. The Coalition Provisional Authority dissolved the Iraqi army and pursued de-Baathification, decisions that pushed trained men with weapons and grievances into instability rather than into a controlled transition. Looting spread, insurgency escalated, sectarian conflict deepened. Abu Ghraib prison photographs in 2004 showed humiliation and abuse at the hands of American personnel, destroying claims that occupation would naturally model legitimacy. Claims about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction collapsed when stockpiles were not found, which injured public trust at home and abroad. The wars also produced a contractor state. Firms such as Halliburton subsidiary KBR and Blackwater entered logistics, security, and reconstruction work on a huge scale. This changed the financial and political structure of the wars. Contracting blurred lines of accountability, inflated cost, and allowed the United States to sustain a large operational footprint without using the draft or making all the manpower visible through regular military channels. Families still carried repeated deployments, traumatic brain injury, PTSD, and the long strain of uncertainty, but the social burden remained unequally distributed. By the late 2000s and 2010s, the war expanded into drones, targeted killing, and special operations across multiple countries. Guantanamo Bay detention, military commissions, enhanced interrogation, and state secrets litigation all showed how law itself had been bent around the emergency. The financial scale reinforced the same pattern. Supplemental appropriations, veterans' care obligations, contractor invoices, reconstruction funds, and equipment replacement costs pushed the wars far beyond the clean budget language used at the start. Counties with large military populations absorbed family strain. Schools received children whose parents cycled through deployments. And VA systems faced the long medical aftermath of blast exposure, chronic pain, and psychological injury. The emergency state was never confined to Washington briefing rooms or distant deserts. Command itself kept adapting around the lack of closure. The 2007 Iraq surge added more troops and a new counterinsurgency script built around neighborhood security, tribal bargaining, and attempts to reduce sectarian killing long enough to create political breathing room. In Afghanistan, later troop increases under Barack Obama carried similar promises about population protection, governance, and training local forces. Yet those promises kept colliding with corruption, safe havens, and the simple fact that no foreign military could manufacture legitimacy on command. George W. Bush's September 20th, 2001 address to a joint session of Congress contains two phrases that carried enormous strategic force. Either you are with us, or you are with the terrorists, and our war on terror begins with al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. Those lines are boundary-setting devices. The first phrase pressures allies, rivals, and domestic critics at the same time. It narrows permissible ambiguity. A government can support the United States or it can risk being classified with the enemy. That binary was useful in the shock of the moment because it created diplomatic leverage and domestic unity. It was also dangerous because real regions, governments, and populations rarely fit a single moral sorting rule. The second phrase is even more consequential. By saying the war does not end there, Bush loosened the conflict from one organization and one battlefield. He transformed retaliation against al-Qaeda into an expandable doctrine. In that room, with smoke still fresh in public memory and lawmakers eager to display resolve, the line functioned as an argument for elastic time and elastic geography. The source is tactical because it sells breadth as necessity. Bush paired grief, righteousness, and duty with a claim that safety required persistent action across multiple fronts. He did not tell the country how long this would last or how constitutional habits might change under the pressure of open-ended war. He did not need to. The emotional force of the speech supplied the authorization that later statutes, memos, and operations would formalize. The address says little about the danger of occupation, the history of prior U.S. entanglement in the Middle East, or the risk that fear could distort intelligence judgment. That silence carries its own pressure. A speech designed to mobilize cannot also dwell on the possibility that mobilization will outrun prudence. Post-9/11 intervention reordered the American state because it made war, surveillance, and emergency management feel like ordinary layers of civic life. The AUMF remained available across administrations. Afghanistan became the nation's longest war. Iraq consumed blood, treasure, and legitimacy while producing no weapons stockpile and no stable democratic showcase equal to the promises made in 2002 and 2003. Homeland Security bureaucracy expanded, watch lists, screening, classified programs, and data collection normalized habits of suspicion that were once described as exceptional. The consequences were not confined to foreign policy. Veterans carried repeated deployments into schools, hospitals, marriages, and labor markets back home. Muslim Americans carried suspicion and surveillance. Taxpayers carried trillions in direct and indirect costs. Congress grew accustomed to delegating broad security authority and then complaining about the results. Presidents of both parties inherited emergency powers that were easier to use than to surrender. The oldest contradiction remained in place. Citizens wanted safety, but many also wanted law to remain law, privacy to remain privacy, and war to remain bounded. The state answered by making boundaries more flexible. Each adaptation had a rationale. Together, they produced a security order that outlived the attack that justified its first expansion. So the unresolved judgment problem is not whether the United States should have done nothing after September 11th. That question is unserious. The harder one is whether a constitutional republic can fight a threat with no fixed battlefield and no agreed endpoint without slowly teaching itself that emergency authority is the most reliable form of normal government.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.